This is the Identity Shockwave podcast, where we explore the journey of self-discovery and the many layers of who we are as we ride this wave called life. 4 questions, real people, endless exploration. I'm your host, Lori Weesjes. Hey, you made it! Welcome to the Identity Shockwave podcast, where we talk about all things identity and self-discovery and who we are and who we want to be and all those great things. My name is Lori, and I am so stoked that you are here. And I'm feeling festive. It's almost Christmas. It's right around the corner. And looking back on this year and this podcast, for example, I launched the podcast in October, actually on my birthday, my 38th birthday. And back then, I was like, I'm going to release an episode once a week. And that quickly became unrealistic. And then I thought maybe I'd do it bi-weekly or twice a month. That's a little bit more manageable. But in the reality of things, I really just don't want to get creatively burnt out, and I want to make sure I'm giving you content that's really thoughtful and intentional and something you enjoy. So I think I'm going to be releasing these episodes once a month, because also I don't want to run out of people to talk to. So if you're listening and you have someone really interesting in your life that you think would want to come on this podcast, hey, shoot me a message. I would love to hear from them. Anywho, today's episode, woohoo! I've been really looking forward to interviewing this person and allowing you to hear all the knowledge and all of the stories that she has to offer. Once again, this is one of my best friends. You see a pattern here? I'm just starting out by interviewing my friends. But hey, I'm lucky to know a lot of really interesting people. So today on the show, we have Dr. Elke Weesjes. She is an academic, she is a professor, and she studies all things counterculture, subculture. She's talked about and studied about the Holocaust. She studies and is writing a book about children of Klan members. And the angles that she comes at with identity and how it relates to her work is truly just, oh man. You're going to learn a lot today. I should just leave it to the podcast and let you listen to it and, form your own takeaway from it. My intro is a gross understatement to all that she does, so just give it a listen. But before we get into it, I just want to say thank you for being on this ride with me. All of your support and encouragement has meant so much, and it keeps me going, and I'm so excited to see what 2024 has to come. So hope you have a wonderful, happy, and healthy holiday season, a prosperous new year, sending love to you and yours. And without further ado, here's our episode with Dr. Elke Weesjes. Dr. Elke Weesjes, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here with us today.
Hi, Lori. I'm so excited to be here too.
And I love calling you doctor. It's a sense of pride for me. It's like, I have a doctor friend.
Who's only good with Band-Aids, by the way, not a real one.
So Elke and I have known each other for 12 years now, you said?
Yes.
It's been 12 years.
Yes, 12 years.
12 years. We met in New York City, and she's become one of my best friends, and so is her husband. And I'm really excited for the things that you have to share today, because I think you're going to give a really, really unique and informed take on identity and all the things that you do. So to kick things off, if you could boil it down to a few words, how would you introduce yourself, and what's your elevator pitch?
I think that this is such a wonderful question, especially if you have to put things down in a few words, because academics are really unable to do that. So I'm gonna try to be concise. So I think that the first thing that pops into my head is Dutch, right? And it's funny how identities work. They are so much related to the space or the environment that you're in, because had I still lived in the Netherlands, being Dutch would not have been an identity marker in any kind of way. Actually, saying that you're Dutch for first and foremost in the Netherlands would make you a bit of a nationalist, right? But here in America, it's that's, it's for me, it's I'm Dutch. So, and then other things, and in no specific order, I would say a mother, an academic, an educator, and a wife.
Those are wonderful descriptors, and that makes me so happy that one of the first things you said was mother, because you have an exceptional child who's an amazing hockey player, and you're just raising a wonderful human. And it's funny that you said that about being Dutch, because adversely, I feel like being a New Yorker, even if you're in New York, you're like, I'm a New Yorker. Like it's something that we all just like really hang on to regardless of where we are. And I think maybe me moving to California, it's even more so now, because I feel like I have to prove myself, and that I need to like show that I'm this identity and this thing. So it's interesting that you say it, in the Netherlands, saying that you're Dutch is like, something of like being like a bit of a nationalist, when here we, maybe because the United States is such a melting pot and we have so many different cultures from everywhere, not to say that other countries don't have that, but I feel like our heritage is something that we hold on to so dearly, especially as Italians, we like to talk about that all the time.
Yeah, but you know what? You know what I think is interesting, though? That we say it with kind of like pride, but it's mostly, in my case, it's kind of like a veiled apology for, I'm sorry, I'm a little weird, but I'm Dutch. That's my excuse. What's yours? you know? And so I think in a way we used identity to kind of, already kind of like set the stage for further kind of things that we're going to do. So maybe you thought about that. It's like, what do you actually try to convey when you say, I'm from New York? What is it that you associate New York with? And what does that mean for the new people that you're about to meet? It's like, are there any kind of behaviors that you feel come with being a New Yorker? Because sometimes I'm like, well, being Dutch and being a New Yorker is not that different, because I think that we have quite a few things in common. For example, talking too fast, maybe being a bit blunt, sometimes not being so kind to one another. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that we have quite a few things in common.
Well, not to mention New Amsterdam was the original name of New York. So, hey, our roots are rooted in
Yeah,
the same.
that's very true. Although, then I have to kind of like break open the can of worms that was colonization, and I don't want to do that.
No, we don't want to go there. That's actually interesting to think about. What is it that I want to convey by saying I'm from New York? And I think it's exactly that. I think it's and I talked about this on another episode, but my abrasiveness. I'm a tough guy. Don't mess with me. I'm from New York.
Yeah,
You don't want to mess with me. It is a shield.
Yeah.
Oh, I like it though. I'm proud of my shield.
Yeah. But it also makes you think more about what you are once you take yourself out of the equation and you're somewhere different. It's like, what are you? It's like, what does that mean for you? What does it mean for others? It's like, that's why identities are so interesting when you think about it, and how it changes constantly.
You've really got the wheels turning now. I'm like, who am I? I thought
Yeah.
this whole time I knew, and now it's just a shield.
Yeah.
Part of your introduction, though, you mentioned that you're an academic. And I feel like we hear that term a lot, and a lot of people don't really understand what that means. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I remember that people used to say that it's just another word for work shy, which isn't really true, because I work really, really, really hard.
Yeah, you do.
But so for me, an academic means that I both teach at college. So I teach at the City University of New York and also at Stockton University in New Jersey. And I do research. And I would say of the two, a lot of people do them in tandem, but of the two, it's like my heart is with doing research and writing books. So that's what I have been doing for, since far too long. But I kind of picked up, I did my PhD. I finished in, 2010. And then I actually had a hiatus and worked kind of on the fringes of academia, worked in psychology a little bit, in publishing. And then about 6 years ago, I kind of went back to, it was actually a person who I'm still very good friends with, who reached out to me, who did a very similar research project as my PhD project, which was about communist families during the Cold War. And he had done something similar in America. And he said, oh, why did you not write a book based on this PhD thesis, or as they call it in America, it's a dissertation. I did my PhD in England, so that's why I use the word thesis. But anyway, so he was actually saying, is like, encouraging me to pick up history again and to write this book. So that's what I did. And while doing that, I also thought, well, maybe I should start teaching history as well. So I kind of went back. I kind of like went full circle, but it did mean that I had to start from scratch again and didn't have much of a network because I did my PhD in England, lived in the Netherlands. A lot of the times when academics want to get jobs, they get it through knowing people, fraternities, sororities, all that kind of stuff. And I didn't have any of that kind of network. So I really had to start at the bottom, and I'm working my way up. But I'm taking on far too much. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm so busy. Perhaps unlike other academics, but yeah, definitely working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. So it's been crazy.
Yeah, I mean, every time we talk to you, it's like you're working on some paper or some book, and it's always something that when you tell me up front, my brain kind of fritzes. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? But then when you're so good at explaining things in such a thoughtful manner that is attainable for everyone to understand, because
Oh, thank you.
yeah, but the concepts you talk about too are, historical things that we know some things about, but you dig deeper into these topics and you
Yeah.
really get to the heart of why, these groups come to be. So you mentioned, working on the fringes, but I think a lot of the research that you do are about groups that are on the fringes too, if I'm
Yeah.
correct.
Very
Yeah.
true.
Would
Yes.
you can you expand on a little bit of the research that you do?
Sure. So back in 2001, I started. I was and I was hired as a intern at the International Institute for Social History, and they asked me to interview people who had grown up in communist families during the Cold War. So this is in the Netherlands, and it was just about their daily life. It was about social isolation. It's like, what was it like to be pretty much hated by everyone else, because this is the Cold War, which was pretty freaking terrible in the Netherlands as well as in America. It's like when you think about McCarthy, a lot of people do know about McCarthy and the Red Scare. In the Netherlands, it was very similar. So these children had a really difficult time. And so I was just really interested in how they experienced life and upbringing and, radicalization, their own political activism. How do they look back on their youth? So I worked on that for almost 20 years. I re-interviewed people. So I kind of, we all grew up together. It was really interesting because I was, of course, what was I, 20 years old when I started that project. And, I didn't have children. I wasn't a parent myself. So as I was working on this project and re-interviewing people, my life had changed, which really changed my whole perspective. And again, identity is really important here, because once you become a mother and you talk about parenthood, you start to look at it from the perspective of the parent rather than from the child. So even though perhaps the stories, I think that every single person's story changes over time, but I also changed. So it was a really interesting kind of journey that it revealed as much about myself as it did of my respondents. So I finished that, or kind of finished that. I wrote many, many research papers and 2 books about this. It's the gift that keeps on giving. I just always find other things to talk about. And, I can even make it sexy. I talked about, one of my papers is titled Distributing Condoms on the Factory Floor. And it's about like sexual health, because communists were like really progressive with lots of things. And so, it kind of sells, sex sells still.
Ooh.
Anyway, so about 3 years ago now, I decided to, complete that project and then move to the complete other side, talking of fringes, right? To your point,
Hmm.
to the radical right. So I thought, I came up with this new project, and it was very similar to my first project. And it was about, I wanted to interview people who had grown up in Klan families in the American South, not because the Klan was only active in the South, and not because racism is confined to the South. That is happening absolutely everywhere, but it was just because it was so prevalent, and you know, they were more popular, but they also resembled more of like a movement or a subculture. So that's what I was interested in, like the social aspects and the cultural aspects. So then I had to find, of course, people, which was really hard, I had to find people who wanted to be interviewed. It took me like 2 years to find 20 people in total. And I didn't just interview people. At the end, I have interviewed about 12 people who grew up in Klan families. 3 of those actually became Klan members themselves. So that was interesting. And I interviewed them all, like at least 2-3 times, 2 to 3 hours each interview. So altogether, very in-depth kind of interviews. And we talked about everything, but we mostly talked about how ideology is being passed from one generation to the next. I was particularly interested in the spaces where people, for the first time, realized that what their parents had told them, their ideology, wasn't reality. It didn't quite match with what they saw. So, for example, for some people, that would be in college. And first, they went to segregated schools. And even after integration, a lot of the children of white supremacists were taken out of these integrated schools and they were put into segregated private schools. In other places, in the South, children were just going to schools that were all white anyway, because they lived in an all white kind of area. But anyway, so they would then go to college, and it would be a fully integrated college. So that was the first time that they would meet people that were on the same power level, right? Because that's such a big difference. Because a lot of Southern people look back fondly on having a close relationship to, the help. And this is, I can't really do the quotation, but the help, which is an awful kind of way of describing someone. Same thing with a mammy, equally weird word. But, these are people that were present in their lives, and they thought that they were really close to it. And yes, there was love. And when you read more about what Black domestic workers, their testimonies are always full of, they really cared for the children that they cared for. But anyway, so none of these, you're employing this person. That person might be terrified of you as well as loving you, but it's very clear that who is on top, right? So then for the first time, they go to college and it's different, right? And then another thing is that they would go off to the army. And that's where I found the most interesting kind of experiences. And I'll tell you about it in a second.
Whoa.
So in the army, they would just, someone told me this anecdote, and I thought it was really interesting. So he was talking about, he grew up in a middle-class family in Jackson, in Mississippi. They had no contact with, Black people whatsoever. So, and he was also told that you don't eat with Black people. They weren't allowed to go to swimming pools anyway. It was like, you don't really interact unless it is needed, So he went into the army, and the first time that he has to shower, he realizes he has to just stand there in this large room, and there is shower heads all around the room. And right next to him is a Black soldier having a shower. And he's standing there and he's looking at his own bare feet. And he's like, and he said, it's like, this sounds hysterical to you, right? But I was thinking about how my feet were touching water that had run off a Black body. And he said, and you know what? Nothing happened. I didn't have any physical reaction. Nothing happened. And he thought that was like the craziest thing. And then he told me about his friend. And his friend had a similar experience also in the army. Again, one of those spaces where people realize that the reality that they grew up with is really not what it, can be outside of their own little white bubble. So this other friend was talking about how it was like sweltering hot, right? It was super hot. He was in South Carolina, base camp or whatever. And on a day off, they were allowed to go out, and they decided to go to a swimming pool. And this was an integrated swimming pool. So there is like these Black soldiers were already in the water. And they said to this man, who obviously had also grown up in a fully segregated family and society, really. And he was like, I'm so hot, I'm just going to dive in. And he had exactly that same kind of realization as he dove into the swimming pool, surrounded by Black bodies. Nothing happened. Nothing happened at all. And that is just like some of the examples of like how people who have been raised, they've been so indoctrinated. They have just been listening. They heard all these stereotypes, and this is just ingrained in their being that the two races must be separate. And then the first time when it comes together, that's what I want to research. I want to see what happens in those spaces and what they do with that experience, because I think the key in our fight against racism lies in those stories. What is it that makes people, break or not follow in their parents' footsteps? What is it exactly that goes? Do they have a moment of realization that they're like, I don't want to do this. This is not for me, even though everyone in their society or community is following that, they decide to break. Why do they do that? So those are some of the things that I'm working on. And it's, obviously I talk too much, but it's really interesting.
My eyes are bulging out of my head right now. How powerful. How powerful. And how needed and necessary those stories and those experiences are. And I've said this to you before, but I think that the work that you're doing is so needed and so necessary, because for those exact reasons that you gave, why? Why did they come to these, realizations, or why did they feel this way, and why and how also do our parents and our upbringing have an influence on how we identify and how we move our way through the world? Whew. We can, I'm sure, throughout this conversation, you'll probably throw in some more anecdotes and stories like that. But wow. So you've explained, being a Dutch woman and coming here, and the work that you do, being an academic and an educator. And, we all have these ebbs and flows as we're coming about these things. And you had mentioned, you started some of the work that you did when you were 20 years old, and you saw yourself change and you saw yourself grow with the folks that you were working with. And throughout this time, was there ever a point when you felt like a fraud or you had imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so I think that this is an even better question. I love this question. And, the answer is yes. It actually made me smile when I saw that question, because yes, I do feel like that all the time. And I have felt like that so many times. And you know what it is? It's okay to feel like that. And I only just came to that realization. So another, an anecdote is that I remember when I was doing my PhD at the University of Sussex, my mentor, who was, he passed away, may he rest in peace. He was an incredible scholar, right? I cannot even put into words how much I looked up to him. He was a boss. I mean, like, the man was fantastic. And he also became a very dear friend. He was like a working class hero, right? And maybe that's one of the reasons why he told me the thing that I'm going to tell you now, is that I had never heard of imposter syndrome. When he told me this story, he said that whenever he spoke at a conference or an important meeting, that he expected someone to raise their hand and ask what the hell he was doing there, that he had no business being there. I mean, this man could fill a lecture hall in a heartbeat, and still he thought that someone was going to call him out, that he didn't belong there. And again, it's like, this could well be because he was, a working class man and an intellectual. Maybe that was one of the reasons that he felt that he didn't quite belong. But anyway, so whenever I feel like a fraud, for no good reason other than I think that, everyone in the room is smarter than me. I don't know what it is about me, but I always think that, but it doesn't keep me actually from speaking, because I do speak up, but then I feel really bad about speaking up. I don't know. I'm a complex person, I guess, but I always think of him when this happens, when I'm kind of overwhelmed with this feeling that I am actually a fraud. And thinking of him gives me kind of like a boost of confidence, because the way that I translated it is that if he has that, then it must be something to do with the fact that we have very high standards, that we are the perfectionists. And those are the people that tend to feel like frauds or imposters, But it's important that we don't feel disabled by these feelings, that we can just place them and think it's like, hey, yeah, this is how you feel. This is how you always feel, but let's just get over it. And let's just do what we have to do, what we set out to do. He also, by the way, this mentor also told me another invaluable lesson. He said to me, if you want to keep your friends, don't talk about your research because it will bore them senseless. And I always try to keep that in mind whenever I meet new people, but sometimes I fail miserably. Thankfully, when I started researching, the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists, people don't find it so boring anymore because it's something that they find quite interesting. So it's, I'm a little bit, I tend to talk a little bit more about my research nowadays.
I'm laughing because I tease you a lot about we'll be out at a bar and we'll be, we'll have had many refreshments and then you'll just go into the Holocaust. I'm like, Elke, there's a place and a time.
Yes, I totally do that. Yes. Yeah. Oh, and yes, speaking of which, there's not only about that some research is deemed boring, some research is deemed completely inappropriate. And then you have to think about the words that you use too. For example, it's like, I can never say, it's like, oh, I had so much fun teaching the Holocaust today,
Yeah.
oh, my students, everything, we can't say that things can only be interesting. It's like, oh, it was very eye-opening. Oh, it was very interesting. It can never be fun. It's like, you can never crack a joke. It's always easy to kind of like make fun of any kind of Nazis because they're kind of funny people. So we can crack a little side joke about, Goebbels or something like that.
Jokes about Nazis are always allowed, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yes, but it is very, very hard. And going back to identity and how things also change as you get older. And for me, again, becoming a mother really made a huge difference. That anything that I show my students that involve, parents trying to save their children, doing so, anything to do with children, I'm bawling. I cry in my classroom quite often, and I don't really mind. At first I was really embarrassed about it, but now I'm like, you know what, I'm a human being and I'm showing you the worst of humanity. So what it's like, it doesn't even seem to make sense to use these two things in one sentence, humanity and what happened during the Holocaust, but yeah, it's definitely, and also speaking of identity, I really try to highlight within these classes, all the different groups of victims. And we talk a lot about intersectionality because, of course, when we talk about identity, we often talk about intersectionality. And I think, you have kind of like hinted as well in past podcasts about like, it's like these things overlap, right? It crosses. It's like there's an intersection where like your multiple identities kind of like meet, right? So in terms of the Holocaust, we talk about, for example, communist Jews or gay Jews, and in a way, intersectionality, interestingly, was kind of, the Nazis were already very much aware of it. For example, if you were a gay Jewish person, you would have a pink triangle and then also a yellow triangle together making a Star of David. So they knew about multiple identities, but then how do you then remember? It's like you go into a crisis situation, you're going into like something like the Holocaust, and you were probably just identifying yourself as, for example, a gay man. And then you become persecuted, not just for being gay, but mostly because you are Jewish. How does that change how you identify? Do you become more Jewish as you are being persecuted in a different way than other gay men? And how does that change things when you come out of that? If you survive mass murder, if you survive something like that, how does that change the way that you identify yourself? So I find those things very interesting. That's why I was so happy to be on this podcast to talk about identities. It's something that I think about all the time.
Yeah, that's why one of the reasons, obviously, because you're a great friend and you have a lot of interesting things to say, but I was really excited because in your research, the expansive identity can just like touch on so many areas like you just mentioned, and it kind of just, it's things that we know of but aren't at the forefront of our minds. And to think about being Jewish and being gay in those times, I couldn't even imagine. I couldn't imagine, like, how do
No.
you choose, but also...
No, but it is very interesting though, because to understand what happened, which is very hard with an atrocity like the Holocaust, but we have compartmentalized all of the victims' experiences. So there was no room after the Holocaust for people who were Jewish and gay. You had to choose lanes, which it was really difficult for people. And the same thing like with gender, women had a drastically different experience than men. It's like, but all of those kind of nuances are kind of gone because you're all kind of lumped into these categories. And I have a real problem with people overemphasizing these categories, because I think that we are made of so much more than just the one identity. And of course, that's kind of what the podcast is about.
Exactly. And, you know, I can identify in so many different ways. I think a lot of the times we identify ourselves either by, like we mentioned earlier, our nationality. A lot of people move, first thing you ask them, especially in this town, Los Angeles, it's like, what do you do? And what they do for their work is like the forefront of their identity. But also, what I'm hoping with this podcast too is that we really get down to like the root of people and where their hearts are at. And that's why I was so happy that one of the first things you said was mother, because I want to understand people of who they are in their core and what really resonates with them. And so I really appreciated hearing that. And with these multiple layers of our identity, which of yours make you most proud and which have you struggled with the most?
When you think about it, or when I think about it, is that everything that I'm proud of, I struggled with. And that makes me think that the two are related. That sense of pride comes often after a struggle, overcoming a struggle,
Mm.
and then you become proud of something, right? So for me, I couldn't even untangle those two things. So for example, I'm incredibly proud to be a mother, but I really, really, really struggled from the start. And, I had so much self-doubt. I found it difficult to juggle being a mom, a wife, a worker. And 8 years later, I still struggle. And parenthood continues to be this crazy roller coaster with these highs and lows that I never experienced before. Totally worth it, but it is full on.
Hmm.
But my son is thriving. And I don't know if I can, give myself a ton of credit for that, because my husband is a fantastic co-parent who looks after our son all the time. But my son is an amazing human being, and I'm very proud of him. What does worry me, though, I work all the time. As I said, I work 6 days a week, and for the past 5 years, I try to make time for my family, but it's been really hard. And I think this is related, and I've been thinking about this a lot. I think it's related to an insatiable need to prove myself. And so it's kind of rooted in insecurity. It's like, if I work harder and I do more and I publish more, then people will take me more like seriously. And for a while, I thought I was doing that all for my family, get a career and get some financial security. And I still think that that's part of it, because I'm still working towards that goal, that I want to have secure employment. And nowadays in academia, it's almost impossible because it's so exploitative. But I would be lying if I say that I would do it all, that I'm doing all of this for someone else.
Hmm.
And I do it for me too. And I think that's fine, as long as you don't become like a selfish narcissist. I never buy it when people who are part of like a competition, like a show on TV, like a reality show, like MasterChef or something, and they always say, I'm doing this for my family, I want to win this for my children. That's bullshit, if you ask me. I'm sorry, but that's bullshit. It's fine to want something for yourself somehow, and I see this especially in women, that it seems like you can't say that as a mother, that you want something for yourself. As soon as you pop out a child, apparently you have to do everything in life for your children, because doing something for yourself is considered unmotherly. And I don't agree with that. I think that my son would be prouder of me at the end if he sees that I have worked towards my own goals, as well as trying to provide for him. So I think that when it comes to, I don't think that we can stack these kind of like identity marker, that one has, more weight than the other. As I was saying, it's like I started with Dutch, but I think that all of those keywords are the same for me. They're all different and they're all the same in weight. So I would never say that I am a mother first and an academic second.
Mhm.
And a wife third. It's like, I don't think that we can rank these types of identities. They're all part of the same thing.
Especially with those three things, they're all so important. It'd be unfair to rank them against each other.
Exactly. It's unfair to ask someone to rank them, because it will put them then into that situation. Again, oftentimes harder for women who are mothers to choose the other thing that they're proud of, maybe their careers. Like, you have to, by definition, say that motherhood is the thing that you are the most proud of.
Mm.
And to me, it's just it's just two of the, things that make me, who I am. So, but going back to your question, aside from motherhood, I also found that, writing books is a struggle. Sometimes I wonder, it's like, why are you doing this? And and I had a child, so I can say this, but it is like childbirth. And I guess that once you publish and you have that relief and the kind of like, you got this product in your hands, and you're like, oh my God, I'm so proud of that. It's great, And then you forgot how hard it was. And then you sign another book contract, and then you're like starting the whole thing again. You're like, oh my God, what am I doing to myself? But yeah, so again, struggle, pride, totally related to one another.
Definitely. Where do you even begin writing a book? I wouldn't even know where to guess. Like, I guess you have a topic that you want to talk about, but chapter 1, like, does it start as easy as that? Like,
No, it doesn't. It's so interesting though. I have lots of ideas that just rattle around in my head. And then whenever I go for a long walk, I just try to make sense of them. Because I think that the worst thing you can do is like, you'll get immediate writer's block if you start to write things down without giving it a lot of thought. So I've thought about my new book for a good 2 years. And I've just had all these ideas, and I kept on kind of reorganizing them in my head until it was time to write it all down in a proposal. And now it all makes sense. But it was really hard, because I was like, how am I going to organize? If you do life histories, which is that you ask your respondents, interviewees, to really talk about their whole life, and that you have these questions that really kind of open up, that encourage them to talk about all sorts of different experiences, from their affectionate behaviors of their parents to like going to school and what that was like, work, friendships, sexuality, all sorts of different things. How on earth, that's really rich material, but how on earth are you going to organize that into a book and a coherent story? So, you really have to think about like the themes and what is it really that you try to convey. So I don't have a lot of attention span. My sister, when ADD was still a thing, nowadays I don't think that they use ADD as a term anymore, but I'm all over the place. I really easily I start with something that I find interesting, and before I know it, I'm like, oh, I have to answer this email. Oh, did I read that book? Oh, did I return that book to the library? Oh God, is my library card expired? Before I know it, it's like, so I have a hard time. I walk, and then I find some kind of peace and quiet, and I start to organize thoughts in my head, and then I write them down. So that's kind of how I go about it. But I'm the slowest worker you can imagine. I think that the reason why I work so many hours a week is because I'm just very slow. I feel like everyone is always doing things so much faster. I can spend an hour on writing one email.
yeah.
I don't think that's normal, but
I feel like there could be a whole course given on the language of email and how we change our language so much to fit what we're trying to convey into words, especially if you're in a professional situation. You're like, you know, Elke, hope you're having a great week. In reference to the conversation we had last week, we don't talk that way. It bugs me
Please
so
find
much.
attached.
Yeah, per our last conversation, please advise. Oh God, it's sending shivers
It
down
would
my
be very
spine.
funny though to start like you know, a TV show that only talks like that. I mean, at least you have a character who just talks like that. Maybe we will change, the way that we have conversations. And I thought about this a lot. So as a Dutch person, I don't know if other, non-native English speakers have the same issue. But what I often find is that I have reached a plateau. It's like I'm not improving my English, and I'm losing my ability to speak Dutch.
Hmm.
And So it's quite hard for me. The way that I write is really, I call it accessible. It could also be called simplistic. I talk about very complex things. I'm not, it's like, it's not that my lack of variety in my vocabulary has anything to do with kind of like that I can't do complex thinking or something, but it's like the way that I write, it's really accessible. So, people always think that, I do that on purpose, but actually that's all I can do. It's like I can only write in an accessible way. So I'm actually hoping to write more nonfiction. I think I'm ready for that now. So,
Oh, that'll be
um,
cool.
yeah.
The book that you're writing now, is it about the children of the Klan, or what's the
Yes.
subject? Cool.
Yes. That's gonna, yeah, it's gonna be about that.
Wow. That's gonna rock some worlds.
Yes. Well, I'm really hoping the way that I structured it, and I think it's going to be quite interesting. And maybe I actually shouldn't talk about this because the proposal hasn't been approved yet. So let me just. But it's like I'm hoping by giving, collecting these different voices, um, that it's kind of creating the dialogue that a lot of people. I have different voices. So some people have become, anti-racist activists. Others are unwilling to condemn their parents' beliefs, and others have completely followed and have joined white supremacist organizations themselves. I've collected all of those kind of stories, and I let them speak in my book, and I'm trying to kind of recreate a dialogue that is absent in today's society. It's like we're living in this really polarized world that people have a really hard time listening or interacting with people that have, ideas and beliefs opposite of theirs. So I'm hoping that it just kind of like gives you a model of how to deal with people who aren't on the same political page or who do have different racial beliefs, but also to appreciate how long the journey often takes from being raised under these circumstances that are really quite extreme, and how long it takes to kind of like re-socialize and find yourself in a space where you can call yourself an anti-racist. But I feel that people just want these things to happen overnight, and they have very little patience with people who might not know the right words to, talk about race and about racism. And I think that we should give people a little bit more, give them the space to get there, and give them credit for trying. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't, like, that we should stop guiding them through that process. It's really important that we're constantly there, but we can only be there if we actually have conversations with them. So at the end of the day, I think it's important, as we are about to go into Thanksgiving. I don't know when the podcast is going to go online, but if you're sitting around that dinner table with that obnoxious uncle who says the most random, horrible things that are simply not true, it's like, try to have a conversation. It is really important, because I've noticed, and take it from me, I've spoken to people who are straight up Klan members who actually, I spoke to someone who's heading the Klan, in like he's the actual leader of one of the larger Klan groups in America. And
A grand wizard?
yes, he's a Grand Wizard, yes, or Imperial Wizard.
Ah.
Yes. So, and it was really interesting, right? But if I can talk to him, you can talk to that annoying, obnoxious uncle. I think it's important. We need to keep on trying. We cannot take our hands off it. And I know it's what we have done. I think that a lot of people have done that, especially in the last few years, that they are like, I can't do this anymore. I just rather cut all ties with my family. But I think that we need to keep on trying.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I have a couple questions about that because personally, well, I'm one to avoid confrontation. I don't really like it. But I find myself in those situations to get very heightened and frustrated and emotional. And I don't know how to rein in what I'm feeling to be a thoughtful back and forth with somebody, and also when it comes to family members too. I don't want to, as much as I may not believe what they are saying, I don't want to push them away. I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable and unsafe to express these whatever ideologies that they have, because I still want to be able to have that dialogue with them. I still want to be able to let them know, have them feel that like they can express themselves to me in whatever way that is, and which would allow me to open up that dialogue into like, well, it's interesting that you say that. This is what I've found out about this, that, and the other thing. Do you have any anecdotes that we could use to like kind of keep our composure? Or are there, I've heard of different things that people say, like, for instance, like there's this meme or whatever going around saying like, if someone insults you in a meeting, one thing that you could say to them is like, oh, that's an interesting thing you chose to say out loud. You know,
I like that.
there's things like that. There's specific wording and phrases that you can use that'll like trigger something in someone's head to be like, oh, and like, they might not have heard what they said or heard it in the way that it was being conveyed. Do you have any type of advice that you could give in those situations?
Well, I don't, because I wish that I had. I do know, and I've been thinking about this a lot, right? I think that sometimes just by being kind, we don't always have to go into a hardcore debate with someone to have a positive influence on that person. Sometimes it's just being present, being kind. And a lot of our kind of ideology is also inside of, it's also expressed in things that aren't so political at first sight. We talk about things like with our family, you might talk about, climate, but you don't want to bang on about climate change, but you will talk about certain things that seemingly are not connected, So I think it's really important that you need to, if you leave that person's life altogether, they will not hear any of these kind of quite normal stories. You need to be present, and through showing love and trying to be the person who, they might not be, but you should aspire to be. I think that's sometimes the only way that we can deal with family members, because I think with family members it's the hardest, right? Because you love them, but you also hold them to a higher standard. That makes it so difficult to stand up when they say something. You don't want to hurt them. This is, by the way, one of the themes that comes back all the time, is that one of the things that I ask my respondents, especially the ones whose fathers have committed violent acts and hate crimes, that I ask them, how does loving your parent make you feel? Because sometimes you cannot choose who we love. And we should also give people who grow up under those circumstances the space to still love a parent. And I think that we're living in a society where people are expected to condemn their parents once they have gone over to the dark side. And I think that we all know that that people are so complex that they can be a great mother, and they could also be a racist. Sometimes those two things. And it depends on how you want to deal with that. Do you want to just take yourself? Does it become personal? Does it become so overwhelming that you can no longer? I cannot make that decision for a person. I understand why people break with their family, with their community, with everything that they had, because they can no longer find themselves being happy surrounded by this ideology that they don't agree with. So, but going back to your question, I think it's really difficult. And I don't think that I would have any answers what to say to someone. Sometimes I gloss over things that people have said. I don't want to lose them. So I sometimes feel a little dirty afterwards that I didn't correct every single thing that they said.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that you'll ever, and I'll give you an example without actually saying the word, because of course it's a vile word. But for example, I've spoken to people who use the N-word quite liberally. I did not tell them every single time, oh, you can't say that word. Or I didn't even want to say the N-word, because by saying N-word, I already lost them, because they're like, oh, you feel that you're better than me? It's like, you think you're better than me because you don't say it out loud, And those are things that you need to think about when you interview people. It's like, you want them to feel safe, but what is too safe? Am I going to give them a platform? Because this is the biggest kind of danger that you can find yourself in, is that you're giving white supremacists a platform to talk about their ideology. And then what you're trying to do is totally the opposite. The product is totally the opposite of what you intended to do. So it's for each and every one of us to decide what is too far. Where are your personal boundaries talking to someone you don't agree with? So I think, as you were saying, it's like we need to figure that out. And it really also depends on what kind of relationship you have with that person.
Yeah. And thank you for allowing that perspective of having that permission to choose, because, we're always told, and I do firmly believe that we need to stand up, especially as white cis women. We need to stand up and be the ally to discriminated against groups.
Yes.
We need to have that dialogue in order to evoke change. However, you can certainly shut somebody out and not get that message through if all you're doing is pounding them and pounding them.
Yeah.
There has to be, everyone is unique, obviously, and there has to be an open conversation about how you approach these things with different people, because you're kind of alluding to this, but you always want to go with compassion and you always want to lead with love. That's the only way that things are going to change in this world, is if we lead with compassion and with love, not with hatred, not with fear, not with adversity. I don't believe that. And
But we have to stand up. And you make a really good distinction here. It's like, so I am talking about two different kind of situations. If that person that I interview, if I would meet that person in public and that person would do something that's hurting someone else, I would stand up against that person, or at least
for sure.
I like to think that I would, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I then have a intimate conversation one-on-one with this person, I might give them a little bit more leeway that they can explain where they're coming from without shutting it down right away. Was this in public, I would have done, something really quite different. So, but then the question, of course, is, what if I would meet these people in public? What would I do? Because that would be, I don't think that would ever happen, but I wouldn't really know how to deal with that situation either. It's like, am I going to go up there and shake their hand and say, it's like, hey, it's good to see you? I don't think so, but we shared a lot. It's like, and we even had a lot of, we found common ground, and it's really interesting and it's scary, but it's also comforting to find common ground in people that you don't agree with. Because, and I think that a lot of people have an issue with this, right? If they need to see people as evil, as monsters, as almost a species completely different from a human being, in order for it to make sense in their heads, they find it frightening, that just the notion that we share so much and that a lot of people, that we have so much in common with them. Talk about parenthood with any kind of, any of the people that I've spoken to, regardless if they became anti-racist activists or joined the Klan themselves, they spoke about parenthood in exactly the same terms. They wanted exactly the same things for their children. So I find that a comforting thought, because you know what? That's a starting point. We have something in common and we can talk about this. And let's see where it gets us to. Let's see if we can build on these kind of similarities and see if we can find some other ways to kind of bridge, and to see if we can recruit people away from these organizations, or, show them a different ideology that might actually still have the same values. Because after all, if we share this, there must be other things that we can share too. Maybe we can just, try to find them. It's like, search a little harder.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And I think you and I have talked about this separately, but I saw a video once where someone went into a Trump rally and asked
Mm-hmm.
them questions about what they're looking for. And I wish I can give an example of one of the questions, but what it came down to is, we all want the same things. We
We
really
do.
all want the same things. However, they might go about it in a very different way. But at the end of the day, we all want to thrive. We want our families to be safe. And, we want to live in a happy, healthy community. And it's just a matter of when ideology takes over.
Yeah. Yeah. But it sounds so simple, but why can't we talk about that more? About the things that we have in common? Why has society is just so incredibly focused on what we don't have in common? with one another. It's like, I find that, and I don't want to be all kumbaya, but it's like, it's just, I think that we can achieve so much more by focusing on what we do have in common and take it from there.
Yeah. Here at the Identity Shockwave podcast, we love a kumbaya moment. So bring it. Bring it. Well, to pivot a bit in the stories that you were just sharing, decisions were made. Thoughts were brewed from a young age, and it kind of changed the way people lead themselves and live their lives. And I can only imagine that at some point, someone like yourself may have come along and shown them a different perspective that maybe changed your life. So, for you personally, was there ever something like that, or was there ever a decision that you made that changed the trajectory of your life?
There's so many different things, but I really think that the thing that really did change my life is moving to the United States. It has changed my life completely. As you mentioned, I moved to New York City in 2011, and I was supposed to stay for 1 year. That was me. I was like, oh, I have a visa for a year. Let me just stay and, see what it's all about. And then I met you and my husband.
And our ragtag
The
group of
next
friends.
day.
Yeah.
Yes. And so 12 years later, I'm still here. And because I never intended this is quite interesting, actually, going back to going full circle, right? Because I never intended to stay. I never called the United States my home. But as the years went by, and especially after having a child, I realized, going back to the Netherlands, that didn't feel like my home anymore. So this was before I actually called the United States my home. I already felt like the Netherlands was no longer my home. And so I made the decision, and this is only a few years ago, which to some people might sound like crazy that it took me that long to start calling the United States my home. And I gotta say, it's like, of course, the United States is not an easy one to love. I mean, it has lots to offer, but it also has a lot. It's also quite problematic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, it's not like moving to Sweden. It's like, it's like so I'm not a US citizen, and I will never be, because I have to give up my Dutch citizenship in order to become an American citizen.
Really?
And I don't want to do that. For my son, he has dual citizenship, but that's not possible. It depends on the country that you're in. Some of these countries are it's changing, but I'm pretty sure that the Netherlands is still the same. So it's a weird one, and it has to do again with what you were asking is like, what are you? I'm Dutch, so it's a weird one that I identify as Dutch, yet it doesn't feel like home anymore. So I'm this kind of like rootless person. I feel like I'm very happy where I am. Also, one has to keep in mind that you can remain your nationality in New York City. As you also pointed out, there are so many, it's a multicultural society. There's so many people with different backgrounds, and we can all kind of, learn from each other. So it's great. I mean, you're young, you're all going out together. It's wonderful. But it also doesn't, like, living that life, you're not really American, and you're not really actually part of society either. It's like when you're young and you're moving, like, you lived in Williamsburg, I lived in Bed-Stuy. It's like, we're not really part of, that's not the real world in a way. It's also not really part of society. We're living in this weird kind of bubble. It was great. But then you have a child, and then all of a sudden, you got to do these things that Americans do. Crazy. I remember the very first time, Halloween, got to knock on doors and ask for candy. I'm like, what are you doing? I thought it was crazy. I thought it was so embarrassing. So Nina would just like walk up to the door and knock on the door, and I would just turn my back, and I would just like, kind of like shamefully kind of like put my face to the other side, because I was just embarrassed about the notion that you just like knock on someone's door and ask for candy. I thought it was a really weird thing. Then also, like, going through school, a school bus, how exotic. Never been on a school bus. And then my child goes on a school bus. And I know that these things sound, crazy to people, but these are things that you oftentimes only, become aware of after having a child, because your child is an American. My child is an American. So I have to do American things. But going back to your other question about being an imposter, I know I'm an imposter. Not only did I stick out, and for your listeners, I'm a rather tall person, with it's like I don't look in any kind of way American. Everyone always knows that I am not American.
Well, it doesn't help that
So
you ride a bicycle everywhere too.
and wear clogs. Oh no, I don't do that. Only inside the house. um, but yeah, so sometimes I feel like an imposter trying to be like, sitting on the sideline, just, being like a soccer mom or something like that. And we don't even call it soccer. So I'm like, no, it's football. No. But yeah, sitting on the sidelines and just doing the whole, like being a good mom and doing what all these, lovely suburban moms do. Yeah, it's sometimes I feel like I'm a fraud. Not only am I actually a punk that still feels like a teenager, I'm also not an American. And yeah, this is called, football and not soccer. So yeah, there's that.
Wow, yeah, punk teenager. I still very much identify with that. I probably will till I'm 80 years old.
It will never
We'll
change.
never
Oh,
change. You know what? I'm happy about that.
and by the way, the second decision, and I do have to add this too. So the second decision that changed my life was, of course, having my son. And this is an interesting one, not because, for some people it is, of course, it's going to change the trajectory of your life. But in our, like talking about a decision, I got pregnant. It was not planned at all. Actually, the only reason why I got pregnant is because I lost my health insurance and didn't have birth control anymore. So it was really, I lost my job, lost my health insurance. Then I got pregnant. So we really had to make a decision. Do we want this? Is this what we're going to go for? And I was already in my late 30s and I was like, well, this might be my only chance. So let's just go for it, And I remember that phone call with my husband. It's like, shall we do this? And it was just, couldn't really be happy, but then we were happy and we're really pleased. And again, another, just like moving to the United States is one of those things that I've made that decision, and I'm really glad that we stuck with it and that we made it work.
It's funny, I will never get this out of my head, but asking Danny about when you were pregnant and, what do you do? Like, how do you figure it out? And he's like, Laura, you just make it work. And I was like,
Yeah.
and I'll never forget that.
Yeah, you just, what is that word that I'm looking for? Blagging? What's that word? It's like that you're just pretending that you know what you're doing, But anyway, yes, that's what you do as a parent all the time. It's like, you just don't know.
Well, I'd like to give you the opportunity, if there's anything else about your work that we talked a lot about your research and how it relates to identity, but is there anything else that comes to mind that you think is like just really telling about identity and how certain groups, present themselves?
There's something about that. It's totally cool to be proud of an identity marker, but I think that we have to sometimes be more observant of that, how these markers change, right? And how our priorities change and how we're constantly as a person change. As at the start of the podcast, we were talking about like how it changes just by going into a different space, that who you are changes. Like one of the really important kind of examples of this that are given, I taught women and gender studies, the intro to women and gender studies, and they say about, if you're gay and black, you're in a gay bar, you might not even have at that point in time, you might there's like, depending on what the kind of racial makeup is in that particular bar, but it might be that those identity markers don't really matter. Maybe you feel more like, oh, I'm gay, I'm proud, I'm gay, blah blah. Then you walk out of that and you're going home through a white neighborhood, you're stopped by the police. You're not gay anymore, you're black. Right? This is what happens in a nutshell in a lot of different ways, how we see our identities. And I think I think that we have to give people the room to kind of like change their identities, because it is a personal thing, but it is also a reaction. Being like, your identity is also a reaction to your environment.
Oh, yeah.
And that dynamic is really misunderstood, I think, among a lot of people who are kind of like holding on. It's like, you can only be this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not like that. And you said it so in your very first, it's like describing your own identities as, an Italian American, as a vegan, as a woman. It's like, yeah, sometimes we we can almost forget about the other identities because we really zoom in on the one, and that is fine. And people are allowed to do that. It's their identities. I don't think that people should be judgy about it.
Mm-hmm. I feel like a lot of the times being, as you might say, a chameleon gets looked down upon. Gets
Yes.
looked down upon as being a people pleaser or being,
Yeah,
a shapeshifter, that you're not being your most authentic self. And
absolutely.
it
Yes.
also is like kind of like I don't know if defense mechanism is the way the right way to put it, but like as a way of assimilating to protect yourself.
Very true. It's like, and but again, it's up to that person. I don't think that judgment from others is going to be very helpful. I think that being called out as, a bad, whatever, bad vegan, for example, it's like there's a lot of people who have a lot of judgment,
There's a
right?
whole documentary
And
about that.
what does it help to be that judgmental? It's like, if you want to do those things, then that is totally fine. That's your life. And as long as it doesn't hurt others, to me, I'm like, that is fine. Whatever, floats your boat. Is that how you say it?
Yep.
But we need to stop kind of like pushing our own ideas onto other people. It's like there shouldn't be, like we're already living compartmentalized lives enough that we, what makes someone a friend, that you have to be almost identical in every single way. And it's tiresome. And also, you know what? It gets really boring to be at a party with only people who are all the same. I like the idea of having different people with different ideas. Yeah. And sometimes I will not agree with those ideas, as long as those people are not hurting other people, either emotionally or physically, then it's fine with me. I will sit there and I'll have a conversation. And you know what? I might actually learn a thing or two.
I find it interesting too that, we live in coastal cities, and
Yeah.
we're lucky to live in these places because we do have folks of all walks of life that we will experience different opinions and cultures that you might not get in other places. It only was until I started touring with bands that I saw Middle America and I saw the South and I saw places that, aren't as diverse as you find in coastal towns and coastal cities. And I think it's so important. I'm very, very grateful and fortunate to live in a city that is predominantly Black, but also has a really big Latino culture. And, it's only bringing in more and more folks that want to.
They're looking for it. I do agree with you. But then again, I was really quite shocked when I came to New York that, I came from a city at the time. I was living in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam is really small. So you'll see the same people all the time. It feels almost like suffocating sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be moving to New York City. It's going to be great. I teach in Brooklyn, right? Our school is one of the most diverse schools in the whole of America. There's 170 languages, something stupid, being spoken in my school. It's like it's insane. Don't quote me on that, but it's something a lot of different languages. And everyone is sitting with each other in their own little pods. It's like they're not interacting at all with one another. So I do think it's like you're using the term like a melting pot. I think it's unfortunate that in our kind of, in our struggle to maintain identity, which is so important, it's like we no longer have to fully assimilate. But then again, that's a little bit of a lie as well, because to really count in this world, it's like we somehow have to adjust and conform to certain standards, right? So in that process, we sometimes lose our identity. But I do think that we can try harder to, while maintaining identity and while maintaining our own culture, that we also find kind of like spaces to interact with people from different cultures and really try to make more of an effort with that.
Well, I like to end our conversations by circling back to my first question. Having had all this discussion, and you kind of touched on it earlier, but would you still introduce or describe yourself in the same way as you did in the beginning of the show?
Yes. Although, well, that's another good question, I suppose. Maybe the Dutch thing now doesn't seem so much of a priority anymore. Maybe what we were talking about is sometimes we use identity as a shield to kind of already apologize what might come. I think that this conversation went quite well, but I might have to listen to the recording to actually see if I still need to kind of make the disclaimer. I'm Dutch, what's your excuse? But no, I think that the things that I have said, and of course, I'm a little older. I'm going to be 44 next month. I think that if you haven't had it, like, you need to figure things out. Of course, you can still like have add-ons. Certain things become more important, other things become less important. But I think you gotta figure out what you are, and I think that I have figured it out by now. I'm still working on many things, and but the things that I told you who I am, those words, I know that in 40 years' time, that's exactly what I still am.
And we constantly evolve, but what's great about that and what's great about you and I together is that we evolve together and we support each other and wherever we are growing into. But I think at our core, we're just still loving, compassionate, nerdy punk teenagers.
Oh, yes, we are indeed.
Dr. Elke Weesjes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a blast. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Identity Shockwave podcast, hosted by me, Lori Vaitzig. Catch us next time for a new episode with a different guest that is sure to keep the conversation interesting. A big thank you to Let Me Crazy for letting us use their music. I'll catch you later.